only been a week ago that we were reading together and having a lot of fun, but today we're reading from a different place. So where are we?
We're in the dining room.
Now, did Nana forget to take down her Christmas decorations?
No.
Well, what does this mean then? Is it like this, like all the time?
Yes.
Why in the world does it look like this all of the time?
Because Nana likes Saint Nicholas.
She especially likes St. Nicholas when he looks like a what?
A bishop.
A bishop, yeah. And so years ago, what happened is she received a few of those gifts with Nicholas with a mitre on his head, bishop's hat, right? And more people heard about it, and more people heard about it, and the next thing you know, more came in as gifts. In fact, when we were looking here, you were looking at something in particular. What was it?
The ornament.
The ornaments. What's so unique about these ornaments?
Because they all have like Christmas. They're all Christmas themed.
And is there anything unique about some of them?
Yeah.
Why don't you point to one and show so that people can see what you're looking at right now to get an idea. Like there, what's it say up there?
Bishop and Bill.
Oh yeah, and is there anything else on it? Is that a year? The year? Okay, so we know every year. It says, with love from Tom and Heather. So friends of ours from our cathedral in Peoria moved to Michigan, and every year they get that for us. And so you could call this almost the Tom and Heather tree almost, because of all these nice ornaments that we have with their name on it. But somebody on top is always going around. I don't know if he ever gets to where he wants to go. He just keeps on going around in circles, doesn't he?
Are you gonna stop soon?
Yeah, probably that's what's going to happen when we're finished. But we've been having so much fun. But I see something else here. What's this?
A merry-go-round.
What kind of figures are in there?
A lion, a tiger, 2 horses, a giraffe, a kangaroo, a polar bear, and a reindeer.
And which one would you want to sit on?
This one.
Oh,
A giraffe.
a giraffe. I think that would be great. You know, he would really stick his neck out for you. Did you know that? Yeah. But you know, the thing I'm wondering is, pretending is good. I hope all of you take time out to pretend. If you're young like us, then maybe you already like to pretend, but you can pretend more. And sometimes just think about people you know and you remember, and have a little bit of fun with things. Everybody gets a little too serious. Now, let's pretend for just a moment.
Okay.
All of a sudden, you went, and I said, "Oh, Nana, I shrunk the kid." Where would Betty be? She would be on top of...
Yeah, I would be like, what the?
Yeah.
What happened?
I know.
Okay.
And, you know...
Oh, the merry-go-round.
But people
Oh,
like
yay!
can you imagine how small the popcorn would have to be if you went down
You have
under?
to crush it.
Yeah, it would be
Yeah.
really small, I know. But I wouldn't have to buy you as much cotton candy.
Yeah.
In fact, didn't you ride on one of these?
Yes.
About a year ago, where were we?
Kennywood.
And where's that?
In Pennsylvania.
What's so special about Pennsylvania?
My mom was born there.
Uh-huh.
And Nana are from there.
Yeah, Nana and I are from there too. So Pennsylvania, near a place called Pittsburgh. That's right. Now, we're not going to talk today about the children of Israel going to Kennywood Park. I just want you to know that's not happening today. We are going to talk, nor are they going to go up and down on the incline like you did. You remember that?
Yes, they are not going to go on the incline because there probably wasn't invented.
It wasn't. And the river we're going to be talking about is not the Monongahela. No. Well, that's the river that you saw when you went up the incline in Pittsburgh.
Oh, yeah.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the children of Israel because they're going to Egypt. All right?
All right.
Do you remember how Pharaoh's chief butler promised Joseph that when he was out of prison, he would remember Joseph and try to get him released? Yeah. Well, the butler forgot all about his promise to Joseph until Pharaoh began to have some dreams that disturbed him. It was 2 full years later, and the king was anxious and worried because he couldn't find anyone in all Egypt who could interpret his dreams. One day the butler was talking to Pharaoh about his dreams, and he snapped his finger. Would you snap your fingers? Yep. And he said, "You know, Your Highness, when I was in prison, there was a man that was very good at dreams." Pharaoh said, "Well, what are you waiting for? Send and fetch him at once." Joseph was going about his duties as chief trustee in the prison when they told him he was going to have an audience with the king. Joseph had almost given up hope, but he knew at last that God had heard his prayers, and he was really excited. Joseph shaved, took a shower. Good idea. They didn't take a shower often enough back then. And they gave him a new suit of clothes to wear when he went before the king, and he looked really very smart. When he appeared in front of the king, Pharaoh said, "I hear you're pretty good at dreams." Joseph said modestly, "Well, sir, it's not really me, but I do stand in pretty well with God. And God sometimes tells me what the dreams are all about." That was enough for Pharaoh. So he began at once to tell Joseph about his dreams. It seemed that in the dream, Pharaoh was standing by the riverbank, and there came wading down the river 7 cows as fat and pretty as ever man did see. And they turned up on the bank and began to feed in the meadow by the river. Remember, not the Monongahela River. After a few minutes, along came 7 other cows, as scrawny and skinny as they could be. And they also turned into the meadows and began to gobble up the fat cows. And when they had finished, they were still as skinny as before. And another dream was just like the first. The king saw 7 stalks of corn and 7 ears as full and ripe as possible, and 7 other ears all withered and dry, and the bad ears ate up the good ears. Joseph said, "That's easy. God's been trying to tell you what's about to happen. There are going to be 7 prosperous years." You know what prosperous means? That means like really super good. Lots of corn, lots of food. Everybody's happy. They can have parties and lots of birthday cake. Very prosperous. Followed by 7 years of drought and famine. Now, you know what a drought and famine are? It's like no water, no food. So 7 years of having all this good food and drink, and now all of a sudden, nothing. It's not growing and it's not there. If I could make a suggestion, Joseph said. "Well, by all means do," said Pharaoh, very much impressed. "Well, sir," said Joseph, "if I were in your shoes, I'd find a man, a very discreet and wise man, and put him in charge of things for the next 14 years. I'd have him build a whole lot of warehouses and grain elevators and storage bins, and during the 7 years of plenty, I'd have him require everyone to bring 1/5 of all their crops to the king's storage bins, so when the famine came, there'd be food enough for everyone. So put up your hand." Okay, how many fingers are there?
5.
Yeah, you know what some people say if you say that? 4th finger's 1 thumb. But I like the idea of, you can say 5 fingers, because that's the point. Now, for just a moment, I want you to take your thumb and go like this. Now what do you have? 4. So what that means is the people would take 1/5 of what they had grown, and they'd take it and give it to the Pharaoh, who would store it up. But there'd still be 4 times for them, and they wouldn't even notice during these 7 years of having everything they wanted to do. And the king said, saying. Now, you know, that's a cracking good idea. And I think I have found the very man for the job. Now, let's think a moment. Joseph made some really good suggestions, didn't he? And then he also said to the Pharaoh, I think you need to find somebody who knows how to do that. Now, who do you think Pharaoh chose? Him. Joseph, he says. You. Now, old King Pharaoh didn't do things halfway. No. He made Joseph the number 2 man in the whole kingdom with all the honors and insignia and privileges of this high office. He arranged for Joseph to marry a young woman from one of the best families in Egypt and gave him a palace to live in and servants and all the rest. Joseph was 30 years old when all this had happened. Joseph began to gather up grain and produce and store it away, and sure enough, the next 7 years were among the most prosperous that Egypt had ever seen. And during those years, he had 2 sons. One was named Manasseh, and the other one was Ephraim. You remember last week we asked people to give you suggestions to name your LOL dolls? Did anybody send in Manasseh and Ephraim as the suggested names? I don't think so. So we'll have to work on that. Things happened just like Joseph had said it would, and after 7 years of plenty, the weather changed, and the crops died, and they failed everywhere. Nothing. But in Egypt, there was plenty of food, thanks to Joseph making sure that that food was stored during the 7 good years. As a result, people came from many foreign countries to buy grain in Egypt. Now, the famine was really very bad in the land of Canaan. And Jacob, do you remember Jacob? That's Joseph's daddy. Had heard that grain was available in Egypt. So he sent Joseph's brothers down to Egypt to buy food. That's right. Yeah, you see where that's headed, right? The brothers came to Egypt, and there were so many people buying grain that they had to stand in line. Slowly, they inched forward toward the important-looking Egyptian man who was sitting up at the head of the line selling grain, or rather overseeing the selling. Now, this big shot was none other than Joseph himself. And when the brothers finally got to see him and presented their request for grain, he recognized them. He recognized that those were his brothers, but they had no idea that this was their brother. Yep, because he changed so much. Besides, they thought he was a slave somewhere and naturally didn't expect to see him as such an important person. Because you remember what happened the last time. Whoa.
They ripped. Did they rip?
Yeah.
His jacket?
He did.
And then they sold him to some slave.
That's right. He sold them to some hairy Ishmaelites.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then he went to the place and he got arrested.
That's right.
And now that.
He's had a tough life.
Yes.
But now he's got it all. Plus, he has a chance to see his brothers. So let's figure out what happens. At first, Joseph acted like he didn't want to sell them any grain. He accused them of being spies. They protested and tried to explain it in the process, told him all about their homeland and their family, and mentioned that they had a younger brother who was still at home with their daddy. This was the first Joseph had known about his younger brother. Joseph said, if you're telling me the truth, and if you're not really spies, let me take one of you and hold him as a hostage. You know what that means? You got to go back. I'm holding on to this guy. You go home and bring this other brother that you say you've got at home. And when you come back again, you bring him. Then I'll know that you're telling the truth. Well, that threw them into a panic. They began to moan and carry on among themselves because they knew that Jacob wouldn't let Benjamin out of his sight. Now, Joseph had been talking to them through an interpreter. So what that means is they all spoke their language, which is a little bit like Hebrew, different, but kind of like Hebrew, let's say. And he spoke Egyptian, but he could still speak their language, but he didn't let on who he was. So he spoke Egyptian, he had an interpreter.
How do they sound like?
Well, if you look at the language that the Canaanites were speaking and that the Jews were speaking, and the kind of language actually the Jews speak, sounds like a lot of this, almost like coughing sounds. And it's really kind of funny if you want to see what their numbers look like. Look at the numbers, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is kind of fashioned after the sort of writing that they did in this one language. But their language is a little bit funny, because you know how you read from left to right?
Yeah.
Well, they start at the back of the book and work their way up to the front from right to left, even though the back of the book's the front of the book for them. Wouldn't that be confusing?
So they talk backwards?
You know what? You'd think so, but they don't. They still talk frontwards, even though their books are backwards.
Oh.
So I'll tell you what. After today, we'll go upstairs in the library, and I'll show you what Hebrew and Arabic look like.
Where's the library?
Well, where all those books are, top of the steps, right by the chapel.
Oh, that's kind of not.
That's where I keep all my.
library, but
I keep lots of my language books up there. So anyway, we have an interpreter, and the interpreter is trying to explain exactly what was going on. And so what he did was he began to be sad. Very sad. And what they were saying was that they were in a mess because God was punishing them for what they had done to a brother of theirs. And they acted like they were very sorry for what they had done. And they didn't know that the man who's listening to all of this is the man that they had done this to. Joseph had to get up and go out so they wouldn't see the tears that were coming out of his eyes, down in his face. Because you see, he really loved his brothers in spite of what they had done to him. That's a lesson in life we have to learn, Betty. Sometimes people feel like they have to punch back. They don't have to punch back. Just love back. You see, he still didn't let them know who he was. There wasn't much they could do because they had to have the grain or starve, so they left Simeon, one of the brothers, with the Egyptian as a hostage, and they loaded up their donkeys with sacks full of grain and set off for home. Before they left, Joseph commanded his servants to put their money back in the grain sacks. And you can imagine their surprise when they got home and they opened up their sacks ready to look at their grain, and when they looked inside, there was their money. Uh-oh. They were really scared, and they felt like somebody was playing tricks on them. When they told Jacob what had happened and how this important Egyptian had taken them for spies and had ordered them to bring Benjamin back with them, Jacob nearly had a fit. He said, "No, you'll not take Benjamin away from me, you bungling idiots. Joseph's gone, and now Simeon's gone, and now you want to take Benjamin away too?" Well, the other brothers just stood there looking kind of sheepish because there wasn't anything they could say. Pretty soon, they eat up all the grain that they had received in Egypt, and Jacob told his sons to go back to Egypt to get some more. They said, "Papa, the man won't sell us anymore unless we bring Benjamin." Old Jacob saw there wasn't much else they could do, and unless they wanted to starve, he had to at least take a chance. At last, he reluctantly consented to let Benjamin go. Benjamin, of course, was delighted. He saw the whole thing as an adventure, kind of like a vacation when you're in quarantine, right? And a chance to travel to a foreign country, so off they went. They took a lot of presents for Joseph. Only, of course, they didn't know it was Joseph.
yeah.
Because he even had a different name down there. So, honey, spices, nuts, almonds, and the like. And they carefully took the money that they had found in the sacks after the last trip, plus more money for the second trip. This time, when Joseph saw them in line, he sent his servants and had all of his brothers brought to his own house for dinner. Now imagine that. Here are all these brothers standing in line. They're from another country. Here is the main man, number 2 man in Egypt, and he invites all of them to come to his house for supper. But they didn't know it was for dinner. And they were scared to death, thinking that they were being singled out because of the money they had found in their sacks. And that they
Why
were.
are they afraid of money?
Well, they were afraid that Joseph figured out that the money that they left the first time was gone. They didn't know that he had stuck it back into their sacks. So he gave it back, and they thought that he was going to say, these rascals stole my money. And that's why they were afraid of going to his house. And they were going to be punished for stealing. Well, you should have heard them stammering and explaining to Joseph's steward all about how they didn't even know the money was in the sack. And the steward just looked, knowing, and said, it must have been your God that put the money back in your sacks. You paid me for the grain all right. Wow. Then he told them that they were to have dinner with the important Egyptian, calling him by his Egyptian name, of course. Well, it's a little bit like this. Let me say this. Today is the feast of St. Anthony. And you're part Italian, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because your Nonna is 100% Italian. And her family, your family, there are a lot of men named Antonio and Anthony, and then they're called Tony, and sometimes they're called Sonny, but it's still all the same name. And so you have to keep track of it sometimes. And so these names can be different depending upon the language too. But we'll figure out his Egyptian name, okay? And when Joseph came in at noon, he asked them about their father. And they told him the old man was well. And he said, is this the little brother you spoke of? They said that it was Benjamin. And Joseph was so overcome that he had to leave the room because he felt for sure he was going to cry. And it's funny in a way. Some men think they can't cry. I think they should. Crying's okay.
Yeah. Wait, wasn't he the youngest brother?
Well, he was at that time. But then came along the last of the litter, Benjamin. It even means that in the language. It was an elegant dinner, and they all had a fine old time eating and drinking and singing songs, but Joseph still didn't tell them who he was. He was determined to teach his brothers a lesson they would never forget. When the men got ready to go home, Joseph had his steward put their money back in the mouth, as they opened up the sack, into the mouth of the sack, each one, and had him hide in Benjamin's sack a very, very special silver goblet. Now, silver goblet looks a lot like what's on the altar that we call a chalice at Mass. A silver chalice, it looks a lot like that. And it belonged to Joseph personally, so it was really important to him. So the brothers set out for home, taking Benjamin and Simeon with them, and everybody felt good thinking they were out of trouble at last. And about how glad Jacob would be to get Benjamin and Simeon back safe and sound. They were no more than just a few miles out of town when up came Joseph's steward, galloping up on a big horse. Now, which one of those big horses do you think he would have been on? Which one it would look most like, do you think?
Maybe this one.
Yeah, I think maybe you're right.
One.
That brown one there? So he comes galloping up on a big horse looking very stern and angry. When he got off his horse, he almost shouted at them, "One of you rascals stole my master's silver drinking cup." They, of course, denied it and were so sure they were innocent that they offered to let the steward search them, explaining that if he found it, they would all have to go back and become slaves to the steward's master. Uh-oh.
Where's the searcher?
See that the brothers would have to go back and see Joseph and become his slaves. See how it's all making fun thoughts? The steward, of course, knew where the cup was because he had put it in Benjamin's sack himself. However, he searched their entire luggage. When he finally found it in Benjamin's sack, boy, were the brothers surprised. The steward said, "We'll take this young thief for a slave. The rest of you go home in peace." Now, they couldn't do that. They couldn't face Jacob if they didn't bring Benjamin back safely. So they all saddled up and returned to Joseph's house. Judah went up to Joseph and told him all about how they had once had another brother who is now dead, and how much Jacob loved Benjamin, and how the old man would surely grieve himself to death if the young man didn't return. Judah then offered to be Joseph's slave himself if Joseph would only let Benjamin go. Now, you'll remember from last week that it was Judah who had first suggested that they sell Joseph as a slave. And here he is offering to be Joseph's slave. So Joseph figured they had all repented. You know, repent means, I mean, really, I'm sorry, I'm really, really, really sorry. And had suffered enough misery. So he told them who he was. I'm your brother Joseph. And boy, were they ever surprised. And worried too. For they knew they deserved whatever punishment that they were going to get, right? So it took Joseph some time to convince them that he really wasn't mad at them anymore. And he explained to them that it had all worked out for the best. God, he explained, must have planned it all along, since he was now the governor of Egypt and was in a position to keep the whole family alive during the famine. When they finally realized that Joseph meant it, they all laughed and they cried and they laughed some more and had a fine time getting acquainted again. Joseph sent them back to Canaan, loaded down with presents for all members of the family, and had them move to Egypt, where he gave them some of the best land in the country. Jacob was beside himself with joy when he learned that Joseph was not only still alive, but had become governor of Egypt. He must have been a really proud papa to learn about that. So Jacob moved his whole family, and he had lots of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, down to Egypt and lived there happily for another 14 years. Now remember the 14. 7 years, lots of food. 7 years, okay? So, when Jacob finally died, his sons carried his body back to the land of Canaan and buried him beside Abraham and Isaac, because that's his daddy and his grandfather, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When Joseph, many years later, knew that he was about to die, he called his sons together and prophesied, one day God would see to it that the children of Jacob's children, called the children of Israel, for that was Jacob's other name. He was given another name, just like a lot of people in the Bible have been given another name. For they were going to get ready at some point to return to the land of Canaan. Joseph made his sons promise that when that happened, they would carry his bones with them and bury him beside his father in their homeland. So we'd have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. And sure enough, it happened just as Joseph had prophesied, but that's the end of the story this week. Next week, we will find out how this all turned out. But I'm going to give you a hint. Okay. Remember this name. Remember this name, everybody. Moses. That's it. And next week, tune back here, and we'll talk with you about another story. And so, here we go. Collection of bedtime Bible stories for children by Father Homer Rogers, but being told in Nana's neighborhood.